Welcome to the Gonzo Chronicles. I'm your host, Cyrus Alderwood, the official spokesman for Generation X. Stick around. It's going to get weird, as always. Well. After a long hiatus for the holidays, here we are back with the Gonzo Chronicles. It's mid February, it's flooding, and another snowstorm is coming. But hey, welcome to February. Welcome to Sinus Issues. Welcome to the Gonzo Chronicles. It's going to get weird this year because we're going to have a lot of crazy things talking about disclosure coming up this year. Whole lot of things I think will probably happen in Congress in regards to UFO disclosure and talk about UAPs. We're going to find out probably that some of these people who are the talking heads in the UFO industry are probably misleading a lot of people on purpose, probably just for money. And once again, we're going to learn to not really trust much of anybody. Um, we certainly can't. We see with so many things in culture, pop culture, music, government, industry. It's going to be an interesting year of finding out some things, I think, um, that we should have found out a long time ago. And you know what? That is so Gen X. That is so cool. We're going to get into some really cool Gen X stuff in this episode. We're going to talk about the importance and the impact of grunge music on the culture and how it's still impacting it today. And I'm going to have an interesting confession about grunge music coming up too. But first, an age-old mystery has been solved. On this very show, we did probably a couple times we talked about. There was a book called The Devil in the White City that talked about the serial killer, the infamous serial killer, H. Holmes, and the murder factory. This was early 20th century and took place in Chicago during the World's Fair. And H. Holmes was an infamous serial killer. Man was absolutely brutal. But on a couple of the episodes, we talked about the similarities between H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper. There was the MO was a little too close. There were people actually that came over from Scotland Yard to investigate because there was some theory that H. Holmes, who was in London during the times of the murders, he could have been Jack the Ripper. So,
okay, I found this on the web for who was in London during the time of
all
the
right,
murders.
stop, Siri. Goodness gracious, that absolutely was annoying. But so anyway, after over 100 years, more than a century, the speculation can probably be over. If you haven't heard the news, and you can find this in various news sources, and I'll give those to you here in just a moment. But after more than a century of speculation, the true identity of the infamous serial killer known as Jack the Ripper may have been uncovered. Recent DNA analysis that was conducted by a British researcher by the name of Russell Edwards points to a guy by the name of Aaron Kosminski. He was a 23-year-old Polish barber. And the DNA evidence is showing that he was the man behind those gruesome murders that terrorized London, the Whitechapel district back in 1888. So anyway, I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of something here. As Aaron Kosminski was one of the, I don't know if he was one of the prime suspects, but he was maybe listed as one of them. But anyway, this pivotal evidence in this case is um, the Catherine Eddowes, who was one of the victims. There was a shawl that was believed to have belonged to her, and he was one of Jack the Ripper's victims. Um, so anyway, this guy Edwards, he acquired the shawl and subjected it to some rigorous forensic testing. So the results revealed DNA from both Eddowes and Kosminski, suggesting a direct connection between the two. So anyway, this finding aligns with a lot of historical records that had identified Kosminski as a prime suspect, but they lacked any real concrete evidence to confirm that. Well, anyway, a little bit about Aaron Kosminski. He emerged from Poland, or not emerged, he immigrated from Poland to London, and he worked at a barber as a barber in the Whitechapel area during that time. So anyway, he actually was known to have a lot of mental health issues. One of them being schizophrenia, and he was eventually committed to a mental institution where he died in 1919. But despite being a suspect at the time, the cops weren't able to conclusively link him to the crimes until now. So even with DNA evidence, and what they did is they went and got one of the descendants of Kosminski, and she actually gave up some DNA so they could test and compare, and it came back 100%. While this DNA evidence is pretty compelling, there's still some experts out there that are kind of telling people like to be cautious about this. Um, they also point out that the shawls, uh, that particular shawl was not definitively established, and contamination of the years could have affected the DNA results. Any number of things could have affected it. Um, but additionally, they said that the methods used in the analysis have not yet undergone any significant peer review, which leads for calls to further study and scientifically scrutinize the methods. And that's reasonable. So we want to make sure it's still accurate. And science, well, from what I learned in school, was like always questioning, always questioning. So anyway, despite these reservations, the descendants of the victims are advocating for this official recognition of Kosminski as Jack the Ripper. They really, the relatives of the victims hope this will kind of bring some closure to one of history's most, well, yeah, one of the most notorious unsolved cases ever. However, from what I read under UK law, reopening the case would require approval from the Attorney General over there, which um, has been previously denied over the years consistently due to insufficient new evidence. Well, anyway, that being said, the potential of just unmasking who Jack the Ripper was is pretty significant, and just it's a milestone in criminal history, I think. The DNA findings, it's a really persuasive argument, but the debate's going to continue as to whether the evidence is sufficient to close the case or not. As I guess the scientific community that focuses on this case, as they sort of rally around together and work with legal authorities to deliberate, this is something I think people are going to keep an eye on and watch closely. Hopefully, we'll see something more in television news that will kind of sort of follow this case, or maybe another interesting addendum to the documentary that was seen on Netflix about Jack the Ripper. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. But anyway, if you're looking for the actual articles, you can find one on people.com. You can find one on newyorkpost.com, which is nypost.com. And then there's news.com.au, which I think is Australia or Austria. Anyway, had headlines like 100% match, Jack the Ripper finally solved, this and the other. Whether it is or not, we'll find out. It may still take more time, but uh, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be a fun thing to follow. Um, so let me back up and talk. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of grunge music for all my Gen Xers, and even those that are not, that are younger, that have kind of explored music history and kind of gravitated to some of that and identified with some of that. Um, it took me a long time to sort of figure out grunge. Grunge music is one of those genres it was hard to pin down exactly what was grunge back in the day. It wasn't necessarily just a Seattle sound, but you know, it kind of bled over a little bit into some music that could have been sort of considered pop that might have some good hooks to it. But yeah, it had a huge impact. I think it changed music forever. And let me tell you my little confession about grunge. Growing up Gen Xer in the '80s and early '90s, um, when grunge came on, it was like that punch in the mouth from Nirvana when "Smells Like Teen Spirit" came out, that video. And then at that point, music changed literally overnight, forever. I was so into my own little world of music at that time. I was in a bubble, and growing up, I loved pop music. Things like Prince and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. I loved my heavy metal, even though I wasn't a big Metallica guy or like go to the hard stuff, like the really hard stuff. Well, which today is not really that hard, but things like Anthrax and Megadeth and Metallica, things like that. I was big into hair bands. I love the bands like Kiss and Poison, Motley Crue, Cinderella. All those big bands. Still love that music. It's great. It's a good time. It's fun. But when grunge came on, I avoided it for a long time. For one, it was depressing sounding to me. It was almost like, hey, the party's over. We're not going to listen to nothing but a good time anymore, and we're going to start listening to something that sounds a little darker, a little edgier, and very different stylistically than from what I was used to. Stylistically, I think some of it sounded a little bit more like Hendrix. Um, and, I didn't really, at that time, have an appreciation for that music from that genre before I got into music. So, anyway, for a few years, I avoided it. I really didn't learn to have an appreciation for grunge music until maybe about a decade ago. Because, the 90s were an interesting time in music. And, things changed so rapidly. There was a lot of great music that came out of the '90s too, but I sort of kept away from sounds like Soundgarden and um, Alice in Chains, things like that. But the one song did sort of hook me. One of the first songs that I heard, I'm like, yeah, maybe not all grunge is that bad. And it was early on. It was Pearl Jam's song "Alive." And that video came out. I thought, wow, that is unique. And I don't know, sort of felt that, the lyrics. So I started thinking, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, because grunge changed everything to the point where it wasn't just like, like this song's about having a good time. That really didn't have a lot of like any deep meaning at all. They were just fun. And here grunge come along and rebelled against all that sound. It's like, okay, there is life, there is meaning, and there's something sort of rotten in Denmark sort of thing going on. And I think we all sort of felt that as Gen Xers, like, I think there's a world there we haven't seen, we tried to ignore, and the culture helped us to ignore it. And grunge, if you go back and read some of the lyrics of these bands, it's like this is probably the first time in a long time songs actually had a story to tell, had a real emotion to feel other than thinking with your dick, or having a great time. So it was sort of when I went back and tried to explore grunge, it was eye opening. In fact, when I wouldn't change the trajectory of the way I've enjoyed music, because when I sort of got tired of grunge, I didn't want to listen to grunge, but I wanted to listen to something else. I sort of opened up my musical palette and started to explore things like the blues and like jazz, big band, and of course, going to college in the '90s, of course, you're going to listen to some funk. Sly and the Family Stone, P Funk All Stars, George Clinton, right? So you're gonna listen to a lot of fun things. Like so, that was my trajectory of music. And if it wasn't really for learning how to appreciate those other things, I don't know if I would have ever come back around to appreciate open my mind to appreciate grunge. And it's an interesting thing to look at how grunge impacted the culture and a birth of a new sound. So let's get into this. Um, Grunge wasn't just a genre; it was a movement, and this sort of came out of those. I sort of wrote some notes down here, so forgive me if I sound like a writer. That came out of the rainy streets of Seattle, and It started coming out in the late '80s, actually, and in the early '90s is when this exploded onto mainstream, reshaped rock music, challenged the entire norms of the industry, and really left a mark on generations of musicians that you're still hearing today. So, when I talked about the birth of a sound, I guess it was a product of its environment. So, you have this fusion of punk's raw aggression, as I thought about it, and then heavy metal's distorted guitars. You kind of mash those two a little bit, and you have this kind of a regional sound up there. Um, it was gritty. You had angry, angsty lyrics. You had an anti-establishment attitude, and I think that's what a lot of people, Gen Xers, gravitated to. And we always sort of felt that as Gen Xers, but we really had nowhere to pour that into. We had just what was on MTV and radio. So I guess I've never been there, but the Pacific Northwest, particularly Seattle, I guess was the breeding ground for this new style. And I guess that has to, I guess credit to that has to go to a lot of underground labels like Sub Pop that help that local scene just thrive. Well, anyway, there's some early pioneers in this genre, and I think they're worth mentioning, even though they're not people that I listen to much. And I've got a top 10 songs, grunge songs. I'm going to go through my own personal top 10, but there were early pioneers like Green River, Mudhoney, the Melvins. Those guys laid the groundwork. But when Nirvana's album Nevermind came out in 1991, freaking blew the doors open. Grunge went from something I think local that was sort of in the vein of these guys who laid the groundwork, but it went global. And then right through that door that Nirvana kicked down, bands like Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, another great band, they came through there after that. They dominated the airwaves, and they just kicked my hair metal and glam rock right into obsolescence. And that was the thing that frustrated me most because, like, hey, that's my music. So I felt like I was being railed against in a way, just as a music fan, but I didn't understand the whole concept. I wasn't willing to give it a shot. I guess let's put it that way. My closed mindedness. Um, but in hindsight, as I've thought about this for a number of years, grunge was just more than music. It was a cultural shift. Yeah, it killed glam metal. In the late '80s, rock music was dominated by these hair bands, and it was all about flaunting excess and flashy outfits, over the top guitar solos. I love those things, still do. But grunge stripped everything down to flannel shirts, freaking combat boots, and a no nonsense attitude. And it's that no nonsense attitude I think is so Gen X. Um, and anything else that comes along with that, I guess, hey, it's all up to what you like. The music was definitely unpolished, but the thing about the music was that it was personal, it was relatable, and I feel that now. There was definitely a vibe that you wanted authenticity over image. So unlike all the, I guess, the commercialized pop and rock acts of the time, and there were still those hair band acts still trying to come through and keep up what was going on for a decade. They had no chance of even having any success because they didn't come across as relatable. or personal. So unlike all those acts at the time, grunge artists they just completely rejected that celebrity culture, which I think people are tired of again today. So that grunge attitude still is in the society because we're so sick of the celebrity culture. Um, anyway, their lyrics often tackled some pretty deep themes. Okay, these are themes I think as a writer I really I hate saying that as a writer, but um, these are themes I think everyone can relate to. Themes of depression, um, disillusionment, and I think people feel that today over the last 5, 10 years more than ever. Alienation, and those things resonated deeply with Gen X youth who felt disconnected from mainstream society. And I think there's probably youth today that feel the same way. And that's why I'm so excited about music. If industry music insiders didn't hold such a grip on what goes out there and just let music be, I just imagine the art that could come out of this younger generation. That's exciting to me. But another thing was alternative became mainstream. So before grunge, there was alternative rock, and that was just different alternative. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, some of these others, they brought underground music to the forefront, and that paved the way for later waves of alternative rock, post grunge, and indie bands. Really, um, so it sort of made that all that cool again after grunge came through, and then that could kind of resurface. And to this day, I think still people look for indie bands. They're still wildly popular in an underground sort of way, but also that do-it-yourself mentality. The grunge movement, I think, reinforced the idea that musicians didn't need major labels or polished production, I guess, to succeed. Um, and that carried over into the rise of independent artists in the 2000s and beyond. So it had an impact in that way too. But I kind of want to switch a little bit and talk about how, if I can keep to my outline here, how grunge's heyday was kind of short lived. Yeah, it kind of went from like 89 to 94, 95 ish. I was in college and I went to college. I was in college from 93 and then through grad school for a few years. But it still impacts today. It's still felt. So you have post grunge and alternative rock, and that's bands like Foo Fighters and Bush and Nickelback. I mean, I know a lot of people make fun of Nickelback, but there's still that sort of a little bit of that sound that they carry grunge's a little bit of some of those elements into the late '90s and early 2000s. But I'll admit it's a little bit more radio friendly polish on there. But that's Foo Fighters. Obviously, Dave Grohl was the drummer for Nirvana. Um, so I'm glad when Foo Fighters formed, they didn't try to do a copycat sound of Nirvana. That says a lot for the integrity of that guy and the artist there. Um, so let's take a look at emo and punk rock. So the confessional, I guess, songwriting and raw emotional energy of grunge influenced bands like My Chemical Romance, Fall Out Boy, a couple of bands I like really well, and even some modern punk influenced acts. That was, that's still felt. If you got like that garage rock revival and then indie bands, so I guess those stripped down back to basics approach, I've seen in bands like uh, drawing a blank here, like the White Stripes, the Strokes. That's another one. Um, they owe much to grunge's, I guess, rejection of musical excess. I mean, you strip down to the basics, and that is so grunge in a way. Um, but even modern rock and heavy metal, right? So heavy rock and metal, contemporary heavy acts like where's my Mastodon, Deftones, um, and even some progressive metal bands. I guess they integrate grunge's like moody, downturned guitar work. I guess is the way to phrase that, and especially when it comes to very introspective lyrics. They kept with that deep feeling approach. So even in pop music, like some of their aesthetics, like moody themes, anti-glamour fashion, some of that still surfaces up too. Um, Billie Eilish, for example, very poppy, but she's drawn some comparisons to that darker minimalist approach of some of the grunge icons. Minimalist, that's a good word to describe an attitude from grunge. And when you see that attitude in modern rock, that I think is or modern music since grunge, post grunge, you sort of see that influence. But anyway, grunge changed the trajectory of rock music forever. It wasn't just a rejection of the mainstream; it ended up becoming the mainstream. The peak, I think, in that era of the '90s, like '89 to '95 ish, even though that was kind of a short lived, its influence lived on through generations of musicians since, right? So it has a legacy, much like the distorted power chords of some of its biggest hits. Still, I mean, some songs come on, you're like, "Hey, that's Nirvana." As soon as, but here's the question I have. I know some people that were crushed when Kurt Cobain killed himself. Would grunge have lasted longer if Kurt Cobain hadn't died? I don't know. I'd love to have some discussion with other fans on that. Would it have evolved into something else entirely as Nirvana evolved? We can only speculate about it. Maybe it was that shot fired by Kurt Cobain that sort of was the first nail in the coffin of grunge, as it was. Not its influence, because it was too powerful at the time not to leave a significant influence. Um, but what's certain is that grunge, with all its rawness and rebellion, it left an everlasting imprint on the world of music and pop culture. Um, so, what were the top 10 selling albums of all time? Grunge selling albums, and this will go on. Let me, I've got the list here. It goes through 95. Of course, the number one best-selling album of grunge was "Nevermind" by Nirvana. Came out in 1991. Had songs like "Smells Like Teen Spirit," "Come as You Are," another great song, and that was the thing that kicked them into the mainstream. Sold over 30 million copies. Pearl Jam's album 10 came out in 1991. And of course, Alive is a song on there, Even Flow, Jeremy. Um, it's been certified 13 times platinum. That tells you anything about that album over the years. Soundgarden's Super Unknown came out in '94. That's the one that had Black Hole Sun, Spoon Man. That's been certified 6 times platinum. One of my favorite albums, still to this day, Alice in Chains' Dirt came out in '92. Had songs like Wood and Rooster, 5 times platinum. Big seller still. Another album that I eventually got into, Stone Temple Pilots, Core, 1992. That had that song Creep, if you guys remember that. That was 8 times platinum. Nirvana coming in at number 6 with In Utero, 1993. That was their third and final studio album. Had the song All Apologies, which I love, Heart Shaped Box. 1993, Pearl Jam released the album Versus, and that was number 7 on the top 10 best selling grunge. That had that song Rearview Mirror, which is a great song, and Daughter, 7 times platinum. Stone Temple Pilots released their album Purple in '94, and that had the Interstate Love song. And one of my favorite songs from that era, now that I look back, is Vaseline, 6 times platinum on that one. Alice in Chains self-titled came out in '95. It was also known as that Tripod album. It included songs like Grind and Heaven Beside You. And Courtney Love, her band Hole, the album Live Through This came out in '94. And that's the one that had Doll Parts and Violet on it. And it's been certified platinum. Um, it really, those albums actually influenced the broader landscape of rock music. How did it impact the music and the movie industry? So I started thinking about that, and it really had a significant impact on the movie industry. It included like influenced film soundtracks, the aesthetics of the movies themselves, the storytelling, um, not just in the '90s but beyond. So I guess that raw and emotive sound became a defining element in film soundtracks. And a couple of my favorite soundtracks are on this list. Came out during that era in movies that explored the themes of the rebellion and existential angst and youth culture at the time. Films like Singles, which was a great film. It was a Cameron Crowe film, and I guess that was considered the quintessential grunge movie. I'll throw that up in quotes. It was actually set in Seattle and featured members of Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, and a great soundtrack, really great soundtrack. Um, and that single soundtrack actually helped cement grunge as a cultural movement beyond just music. Another great film came out. This is a Gen X coming of age film called Reality Bites. Came out in 1994. Um, had a lot of alternative grunge on there, so not like as bigger grunge rock bands, but they had things like Dinosaur Jr. on there, Juliana Hatfield, Three. Anyways, also captured the era sound from a different perspective. One of the most fun movies of the '90s came out in '95 called Empire Records. Not really, I wouldn't say necessarily a grunge film, but its alternative soundtrack reflected that post grunge landscape uh, of bands that were really just influenced by that Seattle sound. Now, the aesthetic influence of movies was really that anti fashion ethos. Flannel shirts, ripped jeans, messy hair sort of became a staple of film characters in the '90s when you think about it. And there's some grunge. I would say films that were impacted by the grunge um, heart and soul, I guess, for lack of a better word of saying it. Um, Films that were it was very gritty, stripped down style, influenced a lot of costume designs, and I guess that slacker culture or alternative lifestyles. Films like Clerks, Slacker was another film came out in '91. That really kind of had that minimalist aesthetic look and countercultural themes. Mainstream films like Reality Bites obviously dress characters in grunge inspired fashion. Grunge attitude films, as I've listed three of them here. A couple of them great films. It wasn't like I said, grunge wasn't just a sound; it was an attitude too. Films of this era had the same disillusionment, rebellion, introspection, and which were central to grunge music. So that attitude, what better film can you find that has the attitude of grunge than Fight Club from 1999? Now it's not directly tied to grunge, but you still embody that nihilistic anti-establishment theme that runs through grunge lyrics throughout that era. Um, Another one I think is sort of has a grunge heavy soundtrack, like from I know I would call the Cure grunge, but that dark brooding tone. Um, The Crow from 1994, still a pretty cool movie. And it really resonated with grunge fans. It still had like the Cure and Stone Temple Pilots, and Henry Rollins was on there. Another one, even though this is not one of my favorite movies or anything, was Train Spotting in 1996. Again, you had that same theme of alienation, self destruction, counterculture, rebellion. Hard to understand because the dialect, but because it's set in the UK. But it was really good stuff though. But even after grunge peaked, it still persisted in films that revisited '90s nostalgia now, or continued exploring its themes, like um, Almost Famous from 2000, or Lords of Dogtown in 2005. That's the number. That's one I wrote down here. Um, that do-it-yourself ethos that grunge helped popularize was in those. Um, have you ever noticed it? Like even some of these superhero movies that kids love now, '90s grunge songs pop up. Captain Marvel from 2019 actually had "Come as You Are" from Nirvana in there. It kind of evokes a spirit. But anyway, that being said, um, its impact on movies is more than just music. It shaped an attitude toward art, storytelling, um, and just the aesthetic looks, the fashion of these things. Took it down to a minimalist um, feel, which was great. From indie films to big blockbusters, you can see the influence of grunge even now that depict rebellion, authenticity, which you don't get a lot in mainstream, but because pop culture has gotten away from all that again. And the stories of disaffected youth. So even in the 2020s, it still has an impact. I think we are 2025. Um, you know, the traditional bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden are no longer at the forefront, but they can still be heard across, I guess, multiple genres. Like we mentioned earlier, Foo Fighters, they continue to carry that sound a little bit forward. Newer acts like Royal Blood incorporate like a heavy distorted guitars and raw lyrics that are kind of reminiscent of grunge. Oh, another band I wrote down here, Highly Suspect. You have a lot of grunge revival bands. Artists like the Pretty Reckless, Citizen, Dilly Dally. They've revived grunge elements, blending them with like modern production styles. I actually dig that band, the Pretty Reckless. They're really good. They're really talented. Even outside of rock, like grunge's themes of angst and alienation have found their way into like some hip hop and pop influence. Like I said, Billie Eilish. Um, Anytime you see that dark and moody aesthetic look of grunge with a stripped down production and really introspective lyrics, you got the heart of what grunge had influenced. Um, I guess one of the things I spotted as I was doing some research before I decided to talk about this was you've seen like some '90s grunge fashion, like especially among Gen Z, right? Flannel shirts, ripped jeans, combat boots, baggy, oversized clothing, kind of made a little bit of a comeback. I don't know if it's just because they want to be fashionable in a '90s sort of way, retro. It could be that to them, but it's still neat to see that, you know, kind of modern streetwear kind of stuff in some younger generations. Kind of cool. Um, but the popularity of thrift shopping is probably at a peak, and anyway, that's the anti-corporate, do-it-yourself ethos that grunge represented. Very anti-establishment. Um, Even in TV and film, '90s nostalgia has kind of become a major theme in pop culture, and grunge is often referenced in movies, TV shows, commercials. Shows like Stranger Things and Yellow Jackets use sort of this '90s alternative rock and grunge to set the tone. Um, Even though I know Stranger Things are set in the '80s, but go watch it. I've watched it a dozen times. Um, and a lot of documentaries and biopics are coming out too. Continue to explore grunge's legacy. Um, some looking, into Kurt Cobain, and I think we'll see more when it comes to, um, guys people who have died since that era. Um, anyway, really, really good stuff. So if you haven't um, given much thought to the cultural attitudes and grunge's mood and music and movies and how it's had a lasting legacy, go dig through some of your old CDs if you still have those. Um, like I don't think grunge ever fully disappeared. It sort of evolved, and its impact is still sort of lingering around all these years later. Whether it's the music style or attitude, the spirit of grunge certainly had a huge impact on the artistic landscape. And who knows how long that'll continue? Maybe it's over tomorrow. Maybe it's over 5 years ago, and I just don't know it. But either way, what a ride, man! What a ride the '90s were. Anyway, I've lingered on. I'll be back, and I'll see you down the road on the next Gonzo Chronicles. Real quick before I close, if you get an opportunity, coming up next month, I've got a new book release, The Merlin Deposition. Took 2 years to do this thing, so I would greatly appreciate any support you guys have for picking up one of my books, whether it's on Kindle or paperback, or the Merlin Deposition, which will be a hardback book. So thanks to the partner in crime doing this one, Robert Prather, historian, who wanted me to help him tell an interesting story. He'd never written fiction, and thankfully he read Revelation Calling and really liked that style. So glad that that union happened, and for all the folks at Acclaim Press who took the chance with us to publish this book. So looking forward to this coming out late March. Be on the lookout on Amazon and your local bookstores. If you go into your local bookstore, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for it. They can get it. Thanks again, everyone, and I will see you on down the road.